Welcome to another episode of Sunday School Dropouts podcast.
Hey, hello.
We are so excited that all of you are here with us today. So first things first, I do have an exciting announcement that I want to share with everyone. And that is the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery is offering fall support groups, and there are still some spots available. So if that is something that interests you, please head over to our website for more information and to sign up. And the website is www.traumaresolutionandrecovery.com.
Yes, I'm so excited for that. Before we get into our episode today, I'm really excited because today is our first episode that we are going to have a guest interview on. We're going to be talking to Jeremy Lehmann, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist and somatic experiencing practitioner, and one of our colleagues at the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery. He specializes in working with religious trauma and folks in the queer community, as that's part of his own story, as well as then, what he specializes in with clients. And I'm just really excited. I want to say that this episode is for everybody, whether or not you're in the queer community or not. There's so many things that Jeremy talks about that are just relevant to all of our lives, whether we're in the queer community or we know people in the queer community. I think it's always really helpful to be able to understand different people's experiences and also to be able to say oh yeah, Jeremy's talking about this thing that is a little bit unique to the queer community, but I've also experienced little pieces of that too. And so there's a lot of crossover in what, obviously religious trauma is trauma. And so that doesn't necessarily differentiate depending on your sexuality or gender. And yet I really appreciate how he brings to light some of the differences in working with folks in the queer community, some of the unique pieces of recovery that they are dealing with as a result of religious trauma and a high control religion, fundamentalism, that people who don't identify as queer may not have to deal with, or may not have to deal with in the same amount of intensity. So I'm really excited for everybody to hear the conversation with Jeremy. I think it's really enlightening. Should be good. And then in our next episode, we'll be doing the lived experience piece of what it's like to grow up as a queer individual in the queer community with a special guest, which we'll keep it secret for now, I guess.
Yes, we're excited. We're excited about it, though. Very much so.
Yeah, it's a great interview also. But I think before we get into our conversation with Jeremy, we can do a little segment here of our vocabulary lessons.
Let's do it. This is definitely a concept and question that I have been asked about frequently. The idea, about healing. And
yes.
The idea of it being an ongoing process. You might hear people talk about it not being linear. That's a phrase I hear a lot. That whole concept. But then I think the part that is interesting that I've heard some people compare it to, isn't that a lot like sanctification? Back in our evangelical days. That's this idea of it's the process and you never really get there, but you're always striving. What are your thoughts on that, Laura?
Yeah. Well, first, for those of you who don't know what the word sanctification means, or maybe that wasn't a word you used in the church you grew up in, it's just kind of this process. I jump in here if you define it differently, Andrew, but the way I always kind of learned about it is sanctification is this process of quote unquote working out your salvation. So it was this daily thing where you engage in these practices where you are trying to be more Christ-like. So that could be everything from spiritual disciplines, like you're reading your Bible and prayer and fasting, to then the way that you interact with the world. How do I dress? How do I talk? How do I relate to others? And it's this constant process of becoming more Christ-like for this end goal of heaven, so that we can, be Christ here on earth and be with Christ in heaven. And so that's kind of how I define sanctification. So I don't know if that, do you have anything to add to that before I jump into that?
I mean, honestly, that sounds about from my background, Seventh-day Adventism, that sounds about how they would define it. They would kind of look at like for example, justification being what happened on the cross. That's the initial act of salvation, and then sanctification being the Christian life, the Christian walk thereafter, and the Holy Spirit changing you and all of that. Yeah. So yes, everything you said resonates.
Yeah. I remember when I first started kind of working on kind of defining healing. So for those of you who don't know, my PhD dissertation was actually about the process of healing. I did it specifically around sexualized violence and trauma, including purity culture. But it was this idea of like, what is the experience of living in a healing body after trauma? Healing, ING, not healed, right? What is it like to live in a healing body? And it was this idea of like healing as this ongoing process. Like you said, it's not this linear where you do these things and then you get to this endpoint, you say, period, end of sentence, done. I'm healed. I will not be impacted by what happened to me anymore. And I started to feel like it did feel, or when I shifted that definition to healing, as this ongoing process, I was like, oh, I have done this like every day of my life, like when I was in the church through this process of sanctification, this like living process of like, getting to, like, I wasn't, trying to be more Christ-like in this healing process, but it was this idea of like, I'm always having to work on something. That's kind of what I thought naively. Whereas with sanctification, I felt very similarly too. There's always something I needed to be convicted of, always something that I needed to be working on to be more Christ-like. But what I realized was that sanctification, there is a very specific end goal in mind. It's that you get to heaven, and you're kind of in a way like bypassing experiences here on earth and not being present because you only have this end goal in mind. And with healing, as I've come to understand it, so when we say, I want to be healed, that actually now starts to feel a little bit more like sanctification, because there's this point that we're trying to get to where we say, it doesn't really matter what I'm going through, as long as I get to this point and then I'm healed, then we're good. Whereas I feel like this idea of healing with kind of this ongoing nature is actually more about being present. It's not about a specific end goal that we're trying to get to. It's actually about being present and navigating and living as a healing person in the everyday moments. That's kind of maybe a floaty answer, but that's kind of where I go with it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. No, I like that answer. I like that answer because, like you said, when you say healed, that does sound a lot like the sanctified piece. And, I was just even noticing myself, like, so my clients will love this. I always am asking my clients, what do they notice showing up in their bodies? What do you notice shift, or where does that particular thing show up? Like, where does it show up in your body? And remembering back to when I was still all about sanctification and following Jesus and that whole world, that whole life, it feels like a lifetime ago, but that whole world, you get to a point where you do start to just feel sort of burnt out, hopeless, exhausted, because it's like, it's a never ending thing. It's never going to get better. I'm always going to be striving. And sometimes when I started doing my own like trauma healing as a client, it kind of, like you were saying, I kind of had some of those similar feelings where it's like, there's like almost just like this tension, this tightness in my chest where I'm just like, fuck, like I'm never going to get there. I'm always going to be trying, but never actually arriving.
Yes.
Yeah.
I remember I had this very specific idea of like, okay, when I'm healed from my trauma, I'm going to look this way physically. I'm going to feel this way, like internally. I had like almost like a check mark list of like, this is kind of what my life would be like. And it was very, very specific. And I remember as I was healing, like going through these trauma resolution processes and recovering and things like that, I remember feeling like the things on that list not only were not happening, but it was almost like they were getting further away. And what I was also missing was all the little tiny ways that I was healing, like in every moment where it was like undeniable, where it's like, oh, wow, I responded to this thing differently. Or I showed up here and I had a different coping mechanism that I had access to. Or I was in this situation and I wasn't so anxious or hypervigilant. And I was missing all of that. I wasn't counting any of that because I was like, oh, because it's not meeting this like end goal of what I feel like being a healed person should be. None of this other stuff counted. And my shame increased because I wasn't reaching this idea. And that to me was this piece where I was like, I felt that so many times, like in religion, where I just felt terrible because I had this idea of like what a godly or Christ-like person was supposed to be or look like. And so I was trying to achieve that goal out there, and I was missing my entire life. I was not present for relationships or fun or anything like that because I was just striving towards this goal and I was never able to get it, which kind of, I think, is the point of sanctification too. Like, like you're never going to be, they tell you that it's not going to happen here on this earth, but you're supposed to still try for it, you know?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's like you're just putting everything on hold until this goal is accomplished.
Exactly. Yeah.
But then the subtext is the goal is never really accomplished.
Yes.
Not in this lifetime will be how you'd in the context of sanctification. That's how they'll say it. Like, well, not in this lifetime, you know, it'll be in heaven and God will change you, in the twinkling of an eye and all that.
Yeah.
And then you'll be different. And yes, you have to strive towards that, but you won't actually get it until down the road.
Yeah. That's kind of a bit of a mind fuck, right?
Yeah. Because you end up living an entire life where you're never actually living that life. Everything that you're living is out there. Yeah. Which means, you miss literally everything here on this earth. And I think for me, I want to hear your thoughts too. When I shifted that definition from healed or sanctification to healing, like this is this ongoing process that, I probably will deal with for the rest of my life, but it's not about getting to that specific end goal with the specific picture or categories or characteristics. It actually did allow me to be present, not only to like where the healing was happening, where I could actually be like, oh, wow, yeah, I do see that I responded differently or I chose differently in this relationship or whatever. I was able to see that, but I could celebrate it and be like, wow, this is what living is. It's doing this thing. But I also then was very present then. It allowed me to actually, and still allows me to actually enjoy my life. I'm not just like waiting till I get to this next point. I'm able to be in this moment and say, wow, I can look around and be really proud of what I've built, or I can really enjoy the friends that are in my life, or I can sit with my little puppy on my lap and pet her and just be caught in that moment and love it. And I feel like those are little moments of healing as well, because that was something I was never accustomed to or taught how to do, or that it wasn't taught that those were important moments either. Yeah, I agree. That all resonates very much. I even made a post the other day, maybe a week ago now, or 2 weeks ago on Instagram about this kind of idea that honestly, some of the most powerful healing isn't really in these big moments of like fanfare and epiphany, but rather it's those little micro moments, the ones that are very unassuming, that if you're not paying attention, you very likely won't notice them, or you may discount them, kind of like you were describing. But really, like that's it. It's being able to be present. It's not that with healing, it's not that distressing things won't come up, but that when they do, it's like you can be present with it, with the parts of yourself that are feeling that distress, perhaps. Anyway, but yes, everything you said resonates.
Yeah. I think it's really good to have these conversations, obviously like the vocabulary lessons segment of this podcast is kind of built off of this idea of wanting to dispel kind of some of the things we hear culturally or on social media of like these ideas of, I'm going to heal my trauma. And then, okay, it's never going to impact me again or whatever that is. So to be able to have these conversations, I think, especially this one, gives so much hope because it allows you to say like, hey, wherever I'm at in this process, like maybe here's the challenge to our listeners is to say, wherever I'm at in this process, even if I know I have other things that I'm trying to learn or grow in, can we just like pause in this moment? And can we look back and see how far we've come? I think that's one of the coolest parts about healing that we forget to do is to actually have those reflective moments to say, wow, like a week ago, a month ago, a year ago, how I would have felt in this situation or how I would have handled it would have been like this. And now here I am, and I'm doing things even just 1% differently. And that is healing, right?
Yeah.
And I think to be able to celebrate that and really kind of take joy is so important. That's such an important piece of healing, of resolving and recovering from trauma, is like being present enough to see like, oh yeah, I did do that differently, or I thought differently, or I felt differently. And those are moments of healing. And I just really want to encourage people to be able to celebrate that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's okay to be proud of yourself.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I know that's something that I feel like I need to explicitly say that sometimes for those of us who come out of Christian fundamentalism, because, pride and being proud and being boastful, but it's not boastful, like not in a negative sense anyway. Like it's okay to be proud of yourself because you have come a long way.
Yeah. So I want to put you on the spot as we wrap this up. When you think about your own journey of healing and something that you are proud of, what comes to mind for yourself?
Honestly, just being present with even the hard things that show up. Like, so for example, like, I mean, I've my entire life have had like depression, anxiety type stuff, that sort of stuff shows up a lot. And it still shows up, and it so at the same time doesn't show up in the same way that it used to, but the reason is the way I'm handling it when it shows up. It's like I'm not trying to I'm not like beating myself up like, oh God, I'm doing something wrong because this thing is, because back when I was still very much a Christian, if that was showing up, it's like, oh, am I not praying enough? Am I not studying the Bible enough? Am I not trusting God enough? Because God hasn't given us a spirit of fear, and here's this anxiety. But then even in the secular healing journey, there were still remnants of that where I'm like, I must not be doing something enough, or I wouldn't still be having these things show up. Now it's like it shows up, and I know I'm like, I shamelessly proselytize for parts work, IFS, but I love it. And so that's kind of part of where it's at, where it's like now the stuff shows up, and okay, it can be, I have space to hold that. It's okay. It's allowed to be here. And that itself, that mindset has shifted everything so drastically that, that stuff shows up and it can be really heavy, and I'm not trying to kick it out the door. It's allowed to be here. It's okay. It's parts of me that are, something's going on that maybe they don't feel safe. They're trying to stay safe. Yeah. And I'm actually able to be curious with it. It doesn't mean that it feels good, but letting it exist does take away so much of the intensity and the distress from what it might have been like 5 years ago, or even 1 year ago.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. I love hearing that. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is our little vocabulary lesson on healing.
Awesome. Love it.
All right. Well, next up will be prayer requests.
So today, for our prayer request segment, there is something that I would really like to speak on. So a lot of our listeners have probably heard of the movie Oppenheimer.
Yes.
It's along with the Barbie movie have been big box office successes this summer, and all of that. And so a lot of folks have been talking about it and seeing them. What I want to talk about though is I think it was a couple of weeks ago. I'm not entirely sure the timeline, but it was recent, regarding Oppenheimer specifically. So there was a woman on TikTok, I believe, and possibly Twitter as well, who went viral as she was discussing the safety plan that she and her husband had when the nudity scene came up in Oppenheimer. So
yes, needing to keep his eyes pure.
Yes, absolutely. And And it's so very interesting because I think those of us who grew up in purity culture, any fundamentalist church, it's like, oh,
Mm.
yeah, okay. Like we understand that. We understand that language. I think what's
Yeah.
really interesting is how this went viral. It took on a life of
Hmm.
its own, and it kind of opened up this conversation to the larger world of the internet. So folks who
Yeah.
don't have purity culture backgrounds and maybe
Yeah.
are kind of like reading these threads in bewilderment of like,
Hmm.
this is really, this is, are they serious? Is this satire?
Mm. Yeah.
I'll leave it there. But
Yeah.
what are your thoughts with all of that, Laura? I'm curious.
Yeah. It is so interesting because, there's so many elements of purity culture that have trickled out into mainstream.
Mm,
Um, just things like abstinence only
mhm,
education, different opinions and viewpoints on things like abortion, birth control, those sorts of things. There's such a huge crossover, and we can see how they interplay. But I think what's so interesting is that a lot of people, when they think of purity culture, they're like, oh, that's just don't have sex before you get married. But what those of us on the inside know is that it is so much more than that. And it's what this woman was talking about, having a safety plan to keep, like her husband from lusting maybe, or, like being impure with what he saw. Um, and for those of us inside or who grew up in purity culture, we understand that. But I think those are things that those who didn't grow up in purity culture would have no idea that this was a part of. So of course they would think it's very weird. But I think it's really interesting and shows the kind of exclusivity of high control groups such as purity culture, and so much then of like what I don't know if this is the direction you are thinking, but like just how this exclusive group of people that thinks a very specific way then takes that and puts it onto mainstream culture and says this is the right way, like we have to do these things, like we shouldn't have nudity in a film because that makes a man lust, and it makes him impure and stumble and all these things, and really like it's very concentrated in this group. I have so many thoughts, like just, having grown up with male siblings and
yeah.
being involved in youth groups, and knowing
Mhm.
how much shame, like how much these messages are preached of, don't sin with your eyes and take
Yes.
every thought captive and make sure that you're not putting yourself into these situations where you could possibly sin or lust or anything like that. And it just, yeah, it's very bizarre. And yet I completely understand where this
Hmm.
woman was coming from being in that culture.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's like you said, it's like I understand it. And also
Yeah.
now having kind of stepped out of that culture and done a lot of my own healing, it is like, oh wow, being able to look
Yeah.
back at it and see some of these reactions. It's
Hmm.
what really struck me is two things, is just that kind of what you were saying, but like the stumbling block piece, like having to be hyper vigilant of stumbling blocks as a
Hmm.
man coming out of purity culture, because anything can be a stumbling block, even like depending
Hmm.
on how conservative your background, even like too much, like seeing a woman's clavicle is too much. And
Ooh.
it's like, oh my God. And that's, but seriously, like in some of the
Yeah. Yeah.
conservative strands of Adventism, absolutely. It's like you showed even too much of that. It's like, that's a thing. And then the other piece that I think is very important, because I want to be very mindful that I'm not like just shaming this woman, because
Hmm.
I also recognize in purity culture, evangelicalism, Christian fundamentalism as a whole, there is a disproportionate and unfair burden that's placed upon wives to
Hmm.
like like in this whole thing, she's talking about this as if it's her responsibility to help make sure he doesn't.
Right.
Now, she maybe didn't say that explicitly, and maybe I'm reading into it too much, but I
Hmm.
do know that that programming comes up, and I
Hmm.
do just want to acknowledge that. And I think that is
Hmm.
definitely something that's important and
Yeah.
is incredibly harmful.
Yeah.
The burden that is placed upon women in these
Yeah.
in these marriage
Hmm.
relationships, and within evangelicalism,
Hmm.
within purity
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah, it is very interesting, because I can imagine, obviously, I don't know her intent on or like her internal world of like, why did she decide to share this at a public forum? But I would
Mhm.
imagine it was coming from a sense of being proud, and not in like a
Yeah.
prideful kind of arrogant way, but like being proud of like, how cool is it that like we thought of this way
Mhm.
that I can support my husband so that he doesn't sin, but we can watch this movie and I can, I can then be so like thankful that my husband takes this seriously, so much so that he is aware of these potential stumbling blocks and doesn't want to sin against me. Right? It's kind of this weird, twisted thing, but I would guess that she was probably proud of the idea that they came up with. And it reminds me, back in my almost 20 years ago, I was in a relationship with somebody, and he would when he would go to his classes, he would wear a hooded sweatshirt. And the reason he would wear it is because, when you have the hood up on the sweatshirt, it kind of like it kind of goes past your face a little bit, almost like barriers. And so
Mhm.
he would wear his hood up so that he couldn't see what was like on the right or left of him, essentially so that he couldn't see women, and that he wouldn't be tempted to stare and gawk and stumble and sin against me, that I would, feel a sense of, I don't know, relief, maybe, that I was the only one he had eyes for. And I remember like being in that culture and being like, oh my gosh, like that is such a godly man. I can't believe that I'm dating this person who like takes me, like who prioritizes and values me so much that, he would do this. But then I also felt a lot of jealousy and anger even towards other women if they did not dress according to the standard that I had, because I was like, do you know how hard you're making it for this person, and all men in general? But
Mhm.
it was this weird balance of like feeling really proud and also feeling this immense responsibility of having to warn other women and educate them and essentially tell them what they can and cannot wear, because men are dirty, lustful creatures. Bye, world. It says you're not muted, but I can't hear you at all. Try talking again. Okay, I know this is a little bit weird, but we had a little bit of a technical difficulty. We are back now. I think it was probably just the devil trying to like, come in and mess up our prayer request, but we are back. So
spiritual warfare.
it's real, y'all. It's real. Got to pray it away. Yes, what did we I always heard growing up, like when you're doing something right, the devil doesn't like it. And we're talking about porn. So clearly that's not something the devil likes, I guess. Who knows? Anyways. Yeah. So we were just kind of talking about this woman who had this video. I just shared my experience of this kind of kind of multiple feelings of really proud of this person I dated, while also feeling the immense amount of pressure to keep myself and other women from causing men to stumble. And yeah, Andrew, anything that you want to add to that, as it pertains to this prayer request?
Yeah, well, I mean, and just from the side of that equation and what you just described, like being like the man in a relationship like that in purity culture. And, I definitely had a relationship when I was still very devoutly involved in the Adventist church. That was similar. I don't think I was wearing a hoodie to my college classes, but I was attending a secular state university. And I mean, it was a 4-year, big university in North Carolina. So like tons of people there. And so I definitely remember that being a thing, like literally having conversations of like how I would make sure that I wasn't looking at girls or wasn't like getting into unnecessary extra conversations with any of them, like outside of class type of thing, or, that sort of thing. So as to avoid any and all stumbling blocks. So I can relate to that very much so.
Yeah. Yeah. It is amazing. having come out of that now, it took me a long time to kind of get out of this mindset. I'm curious to know from you too what your experience was, but it is amazing how much easier it is to have relationships with people regardless of gender. What not being in that system, like they're in that system, there's so much hypervigilance and requirement of really keeping watch over yourself and other people. And so there's something really beautiful about like being able to join in relationship with one another and trust that like you can take care of yourself and I can take care of me. And it's not my job to control or protect you, and vice versa. But it actually, what that does is allow for so much like beautiful relationship to actually happen, where we can show up more authentically. And that's one of the things I've really enjoyed about relationships, like outside of that purity culture piece, like to not have the pressure, of making sure that no man ever has a lustful, sinful, stumbling block thought about me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's kind of like, what was the Billy Graham rule? Once you realize that that's bullshit and unnecessary. I mean, just for a funny example, but seriously, like there was so much hypervigilance that took so much bandwidth. So many things that, I had to pay attention to and be concerned about. But it's like, yeah, like you said, it's like healthy boundaries, recognizing that I'm not responsible for your emotions and responses to, it's like, but not like in a dismissive, I don't care about you way, but rather I can set aside that enmeshment piece and now actually open the door for a much healthier relationship that can actually have like that healthy interdependence as opposed to like codependence or something where we're feeling like we're somehow responsible for each other's emotions and responses and all of that,
Yeah. I just thought of this. I have a very good couple friend, a heterosexual couple, and we've been friends for over 10 years. And they were the two people that I really did a lot of my own faith deconstruction with. It was back in the day where social media wasn't a thing. And so it was like the three of us, and, we'd go out for dinner and we'd talk about things and whatever. And I remember the husband texted me one day and he said, hey, my wife is going out of town. I was wondering if you want to grab dinner, one of these nights or whatever. And I remember my instant reaction was like, oh my gosh, I better text her and make sure she knows that like her husband just asked if I wanted to get dinner with him. And is she okay with that? And all these things. And I caught myself before I did that. And I was like, hold on a second. I know and love these two. I trust them. And I trust that like, if he's asking me out to dinner, it's because we just want, like I'm a friend of his, and I can trust that he and his wife have had whatever conversations they need to have in terms of like, what do relationships with different genders look like? And so I was like, okay, I'm going to say yes, because this is one of my closest friends. Of course I want to go grab dinner with him. So we go to dinner, and this is the first time that either of us have ever been to dinner with a different gender without a partner involved, or whatever it is. And so it's just the two of us, and he's a married man and I'm a single woman. So, I mean, Billy Graham rule, be damned, because we were big time sinning by that standard. And we have a great dinner conversation, whatever. And we get to the end where we're, kind of paying the bills or whatever. And I start laughing, and he's like, what? I said, isn't it funny? Like how we don't want to rip each other's clothes off. And he started laughing too, because it was just this ironic thing. Like we had grown up believing like if there was any instance where we were going to be alone together, the sexual temptation would be so strong that we would not be able to withstand it. And neither of us had that thought. And we were just like, oh, here's one of my good friends that I'm enjoying a meal with. And it's really interesting to come out of that. We've since gone out many times, just the two of us, and it's fine. And we never want to rip each other's clothes off. And all the things, right? So, yeah, it's pretty fun outside of the system to be able to play around with things like that.
Yes, but it's amazing though when that's your background. Like it is, it's such a weight lifted.
Yeah.
Once you're out of that and just seeing the difference.
Yeah, I love it. Well, I think this has been a good time of prayer. We really came at the devil, that spiritual warfare. We overcame it.
We overcame. We did.
I love it. All right. Well, in that case, all God's people said, amen.
Amen.
All right. So we are so excited to welcome Jeremy Lehmann to the podcast today. Jeremy is a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of Tennessee, as well as the assistant director at the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, where he also does trauma coaching. Jeremy is a somatic experiencing practitioner and specializes in working with queer folks, especially those who are coming out of high control religious systems. Jeremy's own experiences inside the church, missionary work, and being what he calls professional Christian, as well as his own process of deconstruction and healing from trauma guide him in his work with his clients. Jeremy's passionate about helping folks learn how to engage in safe relationships with others and themselves, as well as returning to the sense of inherent goodness that is already within you. So quick caveat before we jump into today's episode, due to some personal scheduling conflicts, Andrew's not able to make it to this interview today. So it's just me who's going to be interviewing Jeremy. But don't worry, Andrew is going to be back for our next episode. And I'm personally so excited to have Jeremy a part of this podcast episode today, as he is a trusted friend and colleague. We've enjoyed many margaritas and conversations about life and relationships, religion, and healing. I personally deeply value Jeremy's insights and his wisdom, his friendship, his professional insight, as well as his ability to create safety and authenticity in relationships. So without further ado, let's welcome Jeremy to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Laura, for having me.
Yes, it's good. It's good to be here. So I think let's just jump right in. And if you want to share with us just as much or as little as you want to about your own background in high control religion, maybe kind of what led you into being a therapist also that specializes in religious trauma resolution and recovery, specifically within the LGBTQ community.
Sure. So I was born into the church that I spent the first probably 21 years of my life in. My family was I call this one of the embedded families. Everybody I guess probably in 1980s, we didn't have the term mega church, but we were mega church. We were a television church. Our sermons got broadcast on the local Christian television station, and certain Christian television personalities would show up at our church and do week-long things, healing services, all of that stuff.
Was that here in Tennessee?
No, I grew up in Michigan.
Okay.
I grew up in Michigan. My family moved down to Nashville in the mid-90s, but I spent that first part of my life up there. And we were one of the leadership families in the church. My parents were involved in leadership. My dad was on the board. My mom and my dad both taught Sunday school, small groups, all sorts of things like that. When my sister and I were old enough, we became involved in leadership in whatever capacities were available then, age-appropriate ways like being a youth leader, being on youth worship teams, other sort of youth ministry teams. When I finished high school, I spent some time in missions. I've been professionally Christian at points in my life.
What would you call, sorry, not to cut you off, like when you say professional Christian, how would you explain that to people?
Yeah,
I think I get what that means. Yeah.
Being a missionary was part of that. That was my quote career. I don't know to the extent that being a raise your own support sort of a missionary sort of thing is a career, but
right. Yeah.
I mean, it was where I was making my living, I guess. I've been on church boards myself and all sorts of things like that. So I get church space. Church also growing up was kind of an extension of my family of origin. And
yeah,
I was parented as much by that community and raised by that community as much as I was by my two biological parents. So
yeah.
um,
That's a really
that was my
interesting
ecosystem.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I've never put it that way, but I think a lot of people would say that idea of like, I was parented by this system as much as I was parented by my biological parents. That's really important, I think, to like have that differentiation.
I was, when I was in grad school, I was working on my genogram like we do in Marriage and Family Land. And I was trying to figure out how to make sense of that that world as an influence. And I kind of had to figure out, how do I include church as one of the influencers in my genogram, in my family system, which for those people who aren't in Marriage and Family Land, a genogram is almost like a family tree, but it includes family dynamic factors in that map that we're creating on a page. So I grew up in that world, and it shaped how I saw the outside world, how I experienced myself, how I experienced the idea of queerness. Also, just as an aside, I use the word queer. It feels less clunky, and it also, I use it because it's not tied to just sexuality or gender. It's a bigger idea that I'll go into a little bit later. So that's the word that I use, and some of the why. I know that it has some activation for people around it, but for me, that's the one that makes sense for me. And so that's what I use.
I will try to remember to use that then in this conversation, because I think that'll make more sense. Yeah.
And so I grew up when like the AIDS crisis was happening. And so I was aware of that, what was happening to gay men. And I was aware of how like Focus on the Family and other similar quote ministries were talking about this community. And I also heard how like pastors and other faith leaders use the Bible to talk about queer folks. And I didn't see myself in any of these stories. And it was really, so there was a growing up having this sense of difference, but not being able to really give language to what that difference was. When we were, in like junior high and high school and getting the sermons about, lust, and all of my straight male peers were like constantly up at the altar repenting of lust, I was like, this is really weird that I just am such a good Christian and I don't have a problem with it.
You are the true purity culture poster child.
I was such a poster child for like just being so good. And I was actually having a conversation with one of my friends, I don't know, a month or so ago, when we were just talking about some of our growing up stuff. And I said something about I was the well-behaved kid growing up. And I said, kind of pathologically well-behaved.
That's a good way to put it. I feel like people will resensate with that statement.
As soon as that came out of my mouth, I was like, oh, that's sort of uncomfortably true.
I think that is like unfortunately true for most people, that growing up in high control religions, the pathological piece, I've never put words to that. Yeah,
like there was such a sense of like not being, like it was such a like knife edge that I was always walking, and like any misstep was like doom. So growing up, kind of hearing queer people being talked about in this way and not seeing myself in any of the stories that were, and any of the biblical narratives that were being mentioned, it wasn't until I was in my late 20s that I actually came out to myself and realized,
wow.
Oh. Shit. And for me, it was this launched this huge, like, kind of faith reckoning of this is everything that I've been taught about this. And I don't see myself in that story in any ways. And what do I do with all of that? And so I did a lot of reading. This was 2000. And at the very beginning, it was coming up with like what is an appropriate theological argument here for being able to be okay with myself? Or is there a way for me to be able to get there?
Yeah.
So that's some of, I guess, my upbringing story.
Yeah.
Like the kind of context that I grew up in and was raised in.
Yeah. And so I guess then, that kind of formed the basis of like you continued that search and continued to lean further into who you are and really embracing your identity as a queer person.
Yep. And so then in my, let's see, mid 30s, I decided to move up to New York because I just wanted to live in New York.
Yeah.
And while I was there, the side effect or the bonus piece that I got from that was that I got to figure out being a gay man, a queer person, not in the environment of the South, which is where I live now. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and there's this brand of Christianity that's very culturally embedded here.
Right.
And to be in a place where I didn't feel all of that weight, I mean, in New York, nobody cared. Like this was not an interesting piece of information about you. Like it's being queer was a completely valid way to be a human being. And so it was just sort of taken for granted.
Right.
And so not having to be in that position of constantly pushing back against something and just being able to exist kind of opened a lot of freedom to really just, what is it like to be me in the context of my other non-queer relationships and be out in that way. This is also my first relationship started when I moved to New York. We were together for about 5.5 years, moved back to Nashville, split up shortly after. And then that's when I got a therapist for the first time.
Yeah.
And
I'm super curious to hear about that experience.
Yeah. So I went to my therapist to work through a breakup, and it ended up being a lot more significant, the work that we were doing. I kind of, as a result of our work together, decided, I wish that I had done this work a lot sooner. But also, I ended up changing careers. And after 25 years of doing graphic design, decided that I wanted to be a therapist.
I love that. Yes.
Yep. And I went the marriage and family track, not because I want to work with couples in particular, but because of the relational focus and because marriage and family tends to be, there's more opportunity to not rely on diagnosing.
Yeah.
And like the DSM in particular has been a document that's been used against queer people a lot to just pathologize our existence in the first place. And so, so I became a therapist, and then after grad school, began somatic experiencing training, and that postgraduate work really kind of shaped how I do my work with clients. So
I think that's awesome. I mean, I obviously resonate with for those of you who don't know, Jeremy and I share many credentials, as well as just, professional relationship, personal relationship, all the things. So the same reasons that interested you in marriage and family therapy resonate with me too, looking at the systemic pieces, the relationships versus the diagnostic behavioral changes, things like that. I'm interested in that other part. And I mean, I think for me, it's clear why you would be drawn to working with the folks that you work with, but I'm curious to know for you, coming out of the environment you came out of, that religious system, your own identity, how does that inform your work with clients?
So one of the ways that I've described my work in therapy was, especially at the beginning, a big piece of my personal work was about learning how to take up adult space in my own life.
Oh, yeah.
There was a lot of shrinking, minimizing, kind of flying under the radar, being invisible that I had been doing for a lot of my life. And when I talk about like coming out to myself in my late 20s, I think there really was a piece of that information that wasn't safe to even be knowable. And so it sort of had to be kept out of awareness. I really do think that if I had come out sooner to anybody around me, I would have been pushed in the direction of some of the, traumatic attempts that people go through to change their attraction. So, so in some ways it was a protective factor against that. Yeah. And so then as a result of my work in therapy, there was a lot of really having to get to know myself for the first time, developing a relationship with myself, because there was this core aspect of my humanity that kind of had to be sectioned off, and that I was, in some ways, really estranged from.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Developing a relationship with myself was so much a part of, and continues to be so much a part of my own personal work. Yeah.
So that, I mean, I would assume then that your own journey then, of course, can be mirrored in other clients. I'm curious to know, first, because you work with so many queer folks, like what are some of the unique things that you see of people, of folks who are queer, but coming out of high control religions, cults, fundamentalism, where you go, this feels a bit more unique to this group of people, in addition to all the other religious trauma, adverse religious experiences, right? Like anytime we have different identities outside of, cisgender, white, male, we add on different things that we're going, and even that group of people too, cisgender, heterosexual, white men, there's a lot there too. So anytime we add on additional labels, we're also adding on to like, hey, here's some additional things that we're seeing in our offices. So, what are some of the things I don't want to like objectify, like, what are some of the things, but like, as people come into your office, what do you notice?
So when we, first of all, sort of that point of like cis white male, I'm a gay cis white male. And so in some ways I kind of think of myself as privilege minus.
Sure. I can understand that and actually appreciate that. Yeah.
Privilege. And gay white men have a lot of options in how we have a wider range of survival strategies available to us. And we can make decisions about our relationship with privilege that aren't available to other people. So when you stack on other marginalized identities, there's complexity that shows up. And there's this complexity that shows up, the one that you were talking about when queer identity intersects with faith identity. And I think of that overlap in the Venn diagram as this high conflict zone, because I am at the same time, I have two different identities, and these two identities within those groups, there is a lot of mutual antipathy. There's dislike from one side towards the other, and in both directions. And those also, I think it's important to point out that some of that dislike is earned.
That's fair. Yeah.
There is definitely an oppressor side in this relationship.
Yes.
And the difficulties that queer people have with faith communities is a lot of times justified.
I would agree with that. We're recording this way before it's being released. But I mean, today I listened to The Daily, which is the New York Times podcast, and they kind of do highlights from the previous day. And so today's Monday. So from last Friday, and they were talking, their episode today was talking about the Supreme Court rulings. The woman who didn't want to design a website for a wedding website for a gay couple, which
a hypothetical gay couple.
The whole story was made up, but it was interesting. The title of the podcast was basically something about like religion versus queer folks. And it was exactly what you're saying of this, like this dynamic that plays out, that it's really polarized. There isn't, I mean, that's a whole other conversation we could get into, but I think it examples what you're talking about here of going like, there is this oppressor oppressed dynamic, and using religion and faith to justify why I can do this to you is not considered discrimination. It's considered religious freedom.
Yes, I could go into a rant in that direction, but I'm going to avoid it for right now.
We'll take a breath. Yeah.
To kind of get back to some of what you were saying earlier about what do I see in my office that seems to repeat over and over? What patterns do I notice? Yeah. There is there's a disconnection from self.
Yeah.
That often there's a lot of work to do just in that one spot. How do I help the person that I'm sitting with develop a fuller relationship with themselves?
I think that's really interesting. Yeah.
So there's the relationship with self. When we don't have much connection with our own aliveness, vitality, self, it makes it difficult for us to show up as an authentic version of ourselves in our relationships.
Yeah.
And so I see a lot of relationship challenges here. Some of it has to do with relationship to self. Some of it has to do with that we didn't get the practice that our straight peers got when they were going through all of their junior high relationships and practicing dating and figuring out how to flirt and all of those very developmentally normal experiences that my straight peers all got to experience. I didn't date.
Yeah.
My first relationship was in my 30s. I didn't date before then.
Yeah. And I'm curious to know on that front too, would you put also just, platonic peer-to-peer relationships in there too? I can imagine, when you're growing up in the 80s and 90s, and like you said, we've got this AIDS epidemic. I remember this. I was in school during, I was younger, but the fear, right, around gay people, right? And so stay away. And so I can imagine then too, we're talking about having to develop just basic relational skills. How do I befriend somebody who maybe is the same gender as me, but there's not a sexual attraction? And I think this is purity culture. I mean, purity culture plays into this hugely too. But then when we're adding on the queer piece of it, I would imagine there's not much taught about how to just develop even platonic friendships.
Yeah. I noticed when I was in therapy for the first time, and I was 40 when I was figuring this out, I noticed that I put a lot of effort into being likable in my relationships, but I also didn't, I wasn't showing up in a way where I was actually knowable in those relationships.
Okay, so that plays to both dynamics you're talking about, that identity, self-identity, who am I, and then who am I in relation with and to others.
And like, even once I started this coming out journey and coming into like a fuller version of myself, trying to figure out how do I include more of myself in my relationships, learning for the first time in my 40s that, you kind of have to be able to be vulnerable in relationships for connection to be able to thrive. And, great, I'm learning this for the first time at 40.
Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. And also, this sounds like terrible news.
Yeah. Why would I want to do that? Yeah.
Literally, why would I want to do that?
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. Yeah. And so it's, okay, maybe this sounds like a naive question, but I would be curious to know, because I can think about that of having grown up very similarly. I know many of my clients grew up very similarly to you, don't identify as queer, but we have some of the same, it's like, vulnerability in relationships. How do I relate platonically to another person? There's a lot of that overlap. When you talk about like working with queer folks, what do you see, if anything, where you go, there's these added pieces, or are there? Maybe it's just kind of a different way of navigating it than maybe a straight person. Or maybe I should also ask, like what you said earlier, like the identity piece of like, so as a straight person, I've never wondered, if I was straight, right? I've known that, and I've never had to grapple with like, is that a sin or not? So maybe the question actually is like, how does that even like internalize homophobia that comes from culture, but also high control religion? How do those religions, fundamentalism cults that, you know, promote homophobic, transphobic and in an internalized way, like how does that impact this process of healing, or in this case, relating?
Yeah, I think that one of the ways that I kind of describe this is we often in relationships make decisions about pulling aspects of ourselves out of the relationship in order to preserve the relationship.
Yeah.
And so if I have, let's say I'm holding up my hands and there's 10 fingers here, and I decide that, you know, several of these fingers are, you know, I'm going to pull those out. I'm reducing points of connection that are available here. Okay. And if I do this too much, then connection becomes really, really difficult here. I become, it makes it difficult for me to be knowable in this relationship.
That's a really
and so I think that there's a way that we grow up being used to that as a relationship dynamic, where to preserve some connection here, I also have to dial back my authenticity, my realness, and even post coming out with our with families who are still religious, we're often having to navigate this dynamic of how do I make this relationship work when aspects of me, a core aspect of my humanity is not welcome here.
Yeah.
How do I make this workable in a place where it's difficult for me to know how to even make sense here? If I asked any of my straight family to edit out all references to their heterosexuality, all references, when they talk about themselves, they can't talk about family in any way. They can't talk about their kids in any way. They can't talk about their weddings or their engagements or their baby showers or their kids' birth. Like there's so much that has to be pulled out of the conversation that pretty quickly this person would stop making sense.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful way to understand it or explain it so that people can understand that. I think especially for folks who don't identify as queer, it is, you know, they can identify with I have to cut parts of myself off, right? Like, especially in those high control religious contexts. But I think that piece, that identity piece of like, I'm having to shut, like if we have two hands, that's like a whole hand, right?
Yeah. I grew up hearing about being gay was about who you had sex with.
Yes. I mean, and that's all we were taught.
All we were taught.
Yes.
And I'll get to that in a minute. And so, but sexuality is this so much more complex than who we're, or even when we're actually having sex. We don't stop being sexual beings when we're not having sex. I think that there's so much more of our aliveness, vitality, generativity, creativity connected with sexuality than it is just what we do with our.
Yes. Yeah. That's like, I mean, that's a whole other conversation. I think, I mean, I wrote about that in my book too. Like, sexuality is like, it drives our passions. It drives social justice, legislation, like all of these things. And I'm not talking, when I say that, that's not who you have sex with. That's like the inherentness of us as sexual beings. And so then to cut that off and to say that is not welcome in this space, it's like only then these little tiny fragmented pieces of me get to show up because I can't connect to the, like you said, the vitality, the essence of who I am, which I think
this
is
core piece of our humanity. I have to somehow figure out how to edit out to show up in these spaces where that stuff isn't able to be talked about. Back to your question about what else, the other things that I see kind of repeating, there's a lot of difficulty and relating with our sexuality often that shows up here, because all of the language that we grew up with was so danger laden.
Oh gosh, yes. Yes.
This is a disease vector, or people are going to get pregnant that shouldn't be pregnant, or this is just going to send us right to hell. And so developing a comfortable or like any sort of a positive relationship with our sexuality can be really difficult here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So I'm curious to know then, like in your work with folks in the queer community, how do you help them navigate through things like that, whether that is coming out to their family or creating that authentic identity, navigating through like different, I would call them developmental stages. You kind of like reference that, developmentally stunted in a lot of ways. And I think some of these, for folks who don't identify as queer, like, I think you can still take things from this conversation, because a lot of us were developmentally stunted and a lot of us, have different things going on. But I think, like you're talking about, when we have to fragment this really essential part of us, we're having a more complex conversation. So yeah, I'm curious.
So I'm almost always doing trauma work here. And I think of some of the ways that trauma shows up for us. Trauma is in some specific kinds of events that we experience, the explicit attacks against us and our personhood that happen. There's also just the sense of just the environment itself. And there's this knowing that sometimes even based on, we don't talk about these kinds of things. So that's really letting me know that this isn't able to be talked about.
I think that's really important. Like, it's not always what happens. Sometimes it's the absence of what happens or what should happen.
Well, and that's kind of, and so the environmental stuff I sort of think is the lead in the water kind of trauma that just is there. We don't see it. We don't even notice it. And I sometimes distinguish that even from the what didn't happen but should have, where we aren't seen for who we are. I mean, and I think that most people just in general in our culture, sexually, we are our development is kind of neglect conditions.
Yeah. We
only get some very specific kinds of information around puberty that we, that's the need to know kinds of things. And then we're left to fend for ourselves. And it's very mechanical, like, and anatomical and pathological. We get basic information about our bodies, maybe. We're taught these are the pathologies to avoid by not doing that. And it's very limited, the information that we get. We don't get comprehensive understanding of ourselves as sexual beings from cradle to grave. We're just sexual beings. We are. It's not sexualizing kids to tell them that body parts have names.
Yeah. In fact, it helps avoid some of the danger that can be, put upon them later on in life, or that they can perpetrate on other people. We don't grow up when in our formative years, not knowing, I have some autonomy and agency about who touches me where. Like, I mean, and this is drifting into a different conversation, but we're underdeveloped just in general when it comes to our sexuality. Absolutely.
And queer folks get sort of, that's compounded even more by this. This is doubly we can't talk about, not just because of the talking about sex is icky, but also there's a very specific kind of dangerousness that's always attached to, we're like a social danger.
Yeah. I mean, I remember growing up, obviously the general sexuality, what it's reduced to, like within purity culture, fundamentalism, things like that. But then as it came to gay men in particular, and I think this was in part because of the era that I grew up in, 80s, 90s, as well as just the people in my sphere of influence. I know my mom had a really good friend who had a brother who was gay. And we could go over to his house to use his pool, but not while he was there, because that would be, like, not promoting, but that would be like
too much
giving
exposure, probably
permission. Well, maybe like exposure to a gay man, like, oh, what was that going to do? Right. But like almost like this permissiveness of like, my exposure to you means that I'm okay with your quote unquote lifestyle. And that was not okay in religion. But as long as he wasn't there, we could use his swimming pool. Like, so just this very weird thing. And so, yeah, I can see where it's like, we already have this reduced view of sexuality. And then we have this entire group of people where then they want to put that your identity is only your sexuality. Yeah. And then, so that, yeah, like you said, double bad, or, like where there's just so much then it's suppression and oppression really of like an entire group of people, and more, there's more that could be said there.
And there's also all of this, the language that, like the ways that queer people were actually lied about, and the ways that we are described as groomers and all of these other very, very dangerous kinds, all of the language that gets attached there. Yeah. And in ways that don't actually match data. Oh my gosh. Yes. Yeah. And even in that world where all sin is the same, except for gay people, because at least groomers can get jobs in churches, but queer people can't. Like as soon as I realized this was about myself, I was like, well, this means that any ministry sorts of ideas that I had about what my future might look like, this is no longer available to me. Yeah. And so I'm going to have to figure out what my next career path looks like. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball. I know this wasn't on the list of questions I sent you. But I know like in purity culture, if you're socialized male, you are told this list of rules or kind of descriptions about you. And same with those socialized female as well. But like one of the things that men are taught is that, you are this like overly sexual being. You think about sex a minimum of all the time. You have this ravenous sexual appetite. You are unable to control your sexuality and then your sexual activity. And given the opportunity, you'll basically act out on it whenever you can. And so I think about how like we should not be surprised then when men act that way, because we've been teaching them that this is who you are. Now, that's not justification for their behavior at all, but we should not be surprised if we're saying, here's who you are, and then you act that way. And so I'm just curious to know, because I think there's also so many messages that queer folks and even non-queer folks heard about queer folks, right? Of here's who you are, an abomination of this or that. Like when we think about how those messages are internalized, what is, I mean, I'm curious to know, whether it's from your clients or your own experiences, like how does that impact then just you as a human and how you exist in the world? And when I talk about my clients, I'm not generalizing to all of the population because I only know what I see. And in my friend space and in my client space, and I also am in a particular part of the country. And so I don't know how generalizable I see is. Yeah, that's fair. Just that as a caveat. But some of what you're describing there, that's not just purity culture. This is patriarchy. True. And I'm not convinced, like the gay guys that I work with have the most difficulty with relationships with other gay guys. Our go-to people are our straight girlfriends, or at least this is something that I'm starting to see repeated more and more and more. And when I talk to other people outside of my therapy room, I keep getting some of the same feedback that no, the people that I'm vulnerable with aren't going to be one of my gay guy friends. There's a way in which we don't experience ourselves as our own community as real resource in that way. Like this is still kind of taking shape. And so I don't want to overinterpret here, but for whatever reasons, we have a difficult time showing up in relationship with each other, gay guys with gay guys in particular, in ways where we're able to be support for each other. I think there's a way that we've been cut off from what community could be for ourselves. I wonder if some of this has to do with like growing up gay. If there was somebody that seemed too gay, we couldn't actually be friends with them.
Yes. Yeah.
Because that would have been, I don't know, guilty by association or something like that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of ideas kind of floating around in this area that are kind of still really soupy right now and don't have a lot of it. But it's something that I'm starting to see and just be curious about. And
yeah. Well, so I'm wondering, and I'm just thinking off the top of my head, and so I like to read a lot of different viewpoints and hear different people's experiences because I think that's so powerful. And I've listened to straight men talk about a similar struggle of like being able to be vulnerable. But what I'm thinking about here, especially within the context of high control religion, the added piece of if you are gay, it means you're this like sexual monster, even more so, and like that's the definition of sexuality and how that is lived out is, I wonder, is so internalized that it adds this other layer to friendships with other men that it's like, I'm scared of you because I'm scared of me because like I've been told to be scared of you and myself, right? And so it's like, why would we be vulnerable and open and authentic in a relationship like that when we've been told that the other person is a monster and so am I?
Well, and also, I mean, there's this other layer of, as a community, we're a traumatized community.
Yes.
Which is different than being a straight man.
100%. Yeah.
Also traumatized, but in very different ways.
Very different.
So when we are around each other, our defensive and protective strategies probably lead more often than.
I think that's really insightful. Yeah. Yeah.
Lead more than our connection capabilities.
Well, and I think that leads to, the trauma piece of all of this is that when we are traumatized individuals, when our nervous systems are constantly stuck on or off, in that hyper or hypoarousal state, we do that. Like, that's how we interact with the world from that defensive posture, not because even consciously we're like, this is a dangerous person, but because we have been trained. And so as a group of people to say, I live in a culture, or I grew up in a society or a system or whatever that oppressed me, that said who I was evil, awful, whatnot, then my nervous system is going to lead with defensiveness. It's going to lead with skepticism.
And so much of our trauma shows up in the relational field that relationships aren't inherently or reliably trustable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we go in with a lot of having to probably do extra work to gauge whether or not you are safe enough.
Yeah. Do you find in your work with clients that when we talk about the relational piece, how important is it to have like the relationship with self first or before relationship with others? There's those cliche sayings of like, you can't love somebody else until you love yourself, which I find to be trash.
I fucking hate that so much. I think it's the dumbest thing ever. Like, a child comes into the world not knowing anything. The first thing that this kid needs to know is that you're lovable. Absolutely. They learn that they're lovable by being loved first. This child isn't going to manufacture on their own, a sense of, oh, I am inherently lovable. Like, that's not how that works. We learn that we're lovable by being in connection and having experience of being loved.
Yeah.
And this kind of points to my style in the room is very, very, very relational. In a way, especially with my queer folks, it's probably different than my straight clients. I always let people know at the beginning that I'm a knowable person in the room. If you have questions about me, I'm just going to answer them. I'm not going to do the dumb therapist thing of, why is that important for you to know that?
This is why we get along, because we're both like, that's just no.
Like, as a question that's so counter-relational. Yeah. Like, it seems like it's immediately a barrier that shows up that is unnecessary, one. it's very, I don't know, white dude way of doing therapy.
I mean, it is like the stereotypical professional behind the clipboard, cold, one-sided relationship.
Yeah, and it's I guess it works, and if we believe this, that we're doing like medical work or whatever.
Sure.
Anyway, but my style's really relational, and I don't think it's fair to expect my clients to be vulnerable if I'm also not going to be vulnerable.
That's
and
beautiful.
I don't. For a lot of us who don't have examples of other queer people being vulnerable with them, I think it's important to model that in a room where we can be vulnerable. That vulnerability can be held well.
Yes.
And
boundaried. Yeah.
Boundaried. Yes. This is a relationship. I treat it like a relationship. It has different parameters than if we knew each other out in the wild, but this is a relationship. I care how this relationship goes. I care if in this relationship, you're not getting what you need. I care if in this relationship, there's rupture. I care if in this relationship, you feel like you're pulling parts of yourself out rather than being able to continue to bring more of yourself to the relationship.
I love that. I mean, just like from therapist to therapist, I think that's like a really, it's a very different way of doing therapy. And like we said at the beginning, Jeremy and I are friends outside of this. And so these are many margarita-driven conversations that we have had, and including probably tonight too. We'll probably go there too. But I think what you're saying there, and I found this, in my work too, especially with trauma folks, just whether that's religious trauma or other trauma. That relational piece is like the key component of we need that for healing. And I think what you're talking about here with folks in the queer community who have potentially never had the opportunity to experience a safe relationship, and have always had to lead with that sense of defense or skepticism for good reason, for survival, right? So to come into a space and have that like almost a counterbalance of like, oh, in this room, here's this like totally different experience, which can feel really untethering at first, but then the hope would be we can learn to trust that and then bring it out into our other relationships, which I think, I don't know, maybe that's not where you go with your clients, but that's kind of what I'm gathering. And I think that is incredible.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think that it's reasonable to expect that they're going to try being vulnerable out in the wild before they have a safe place where they can do that. And if this is the only safe enough place to do that, then that's kind of where my focus goes. Yeah.
So I'm curious then, when you talk about the relational safety, you and I have talked about this before, this idea of like disembodiment. So we know, of course, again, high control religion really divorces you from yourself, divorces you from your body. Part of healing is getting back into your body, finding that sense of internalized safety. How do you navigate that and balance it, right? With self identity, self internalized safety, as well as my identity in relation to others and safe relationship.
Yeah. So somatic experiencing is kind of the thing that's changed how I work or shaped how I work with folks the most. Yeah. And going through that training, I mean, you went through most of that training with me. It's delivered sort of as a trauma treatment protocol, or not protocol, but the thing that we're doing though is we're helping people pay attention to themselves in a very different way than they're used to. And it seems to me like that very early SE work of like tracking, orienting, grounding, we're helping people develop a more attuned relationship with themselves and being able to tune into, to listen to take seriously what their body is communicating to them about them and their environment and their relationships, learning how to notice what's happening there. And so helping people develop a relationship with the fullness of themselves. I think that our knowing of our own queerness isn't conceptual, it's embodied. There's something neck down that knew I'm different in some way. I can't put my finger on it, but there's something that my body knows that's different from the dominant narrative that I've been getting from the environment around me about, stock off the shelf way to be a human being.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can't remember if it was you or somebody else that I was talking to where we basically were like, queer folks like have the corner market on embodiment while you were taught to shut it down in a totally different way at a very early age. Like for a person who grew up straight, knew they were straight, like never questioned that and was taught that that was the right way. There was a disconnect from your body. It was easier to move into that disconnect where there's always like this inherent beautiful embodiment that you had of going, that's not my experience. I know that. I might not have words to tell you how I know that, but I know it. And I'm like, that needs to be celebrated, like the return back to that.
And this is back to what I was saying kind of at the beginning, that inner knowing, that queer inner knowing, this is like where so much of our resilience, our orientation towards thriving, there's this inner knowing of, I know what I'm expected to conform to. There's something in me that knows something very different. And that something in me that knows something very different is on my side and for me, and is wanting to move me into fuller aliveness.
That's awesome. To me, that sounds so helpful, right? Like all these things, these messages that you've been taught about dirty, evil, disgusting, but to know that there's that inherent goodness that we're just returning back to, it feels so hopeful.
Yeah. And I was actually having a conversation with a friend this morning, actually, and noticing how much energy and effort gets spent by queer folks from religious high control settings just around defending our existence and making a case for ourselves that takes away so much energy from this connecting with our own aliveness.
Yeah.
And when I was thinking about some of this last night, I was thinking about how there's often been this, if I can make a good enough case, then the people that I care about will be on my side. And if that's okay, then I'll be able to be okay.
Yeah.
Instead of, there's already this okayness here, and leaning more into that direction and tapping into that just core goodness is going to come with it comes with some pain in these other relationships that can't keep pace. But for me to spend all of my time, energy, effort into trying to get other people to be okay with, I mean, and I also think that this is systemic strategy, like by the bigger system to drain us of all of the energy that would actually serve us in being alive. But as long as I'm kind of hanging out in that space, or in that space only, maybe it's not even an either or, but it's like finding balance that works. But that keeps me out of contact with this like deep well of goodness. And
so. I think that's really beautiful. So is there anything else that I should be asking you? Anything else that you would want that you go, yeah, you should ask me this, or if depending on that answer, like anything else that you go, I wish those in the queer community would know this.
And queer people, especially probably from high control. I think that some of the ways that we grew up hearing about ourselves and how dangerous we all were kept us out of a fuller sense of community with each other. And I guess I touched on this a bit earlier, but there's resource that's available that we've not been able to foster, cultivate.
Yeah.
Or really even participate in a lot of times.
And so to just normalize that, but also give the hope for that.
I don't know if there's really more to say about that, but I'll probably come up with something tonight while we're
having
chips and salsa.
I love it. Well, one of the things that we've asked you and are asking all of our like our professional guests, those who are like working in the field with survivors and different things, is to prepare just some sort of an intervention or a tool that you use with your clients, and bring it into this, maybe teach it to us or lead us through it. We're calling this the Ministry of Healing. So just a quick disclaimer for anybody who's listening: the interventions that any of our guests are bringing to us, they're optional for you to participate in. You certainly do not have to do any of these. They're just here if you want them. For most of them, make sure that you're not, operating heavy machinery or driving a car or things like that, but that you're in a space where you feel safe and maybe, not on the road, able to harm others. But like I said, you always have the option to do this or to not do this. You can pause this and come back to it. You can fast forward through this, whatever, come back to it at any time. So that's a little disclaimer. And I'll turn it back to you, Jeremy. Tell us, what are you bringing us today for the Ministry of Healing?
Yes. Oh my God. So there's this one that I was planning on doing, and then I had this other idea. No, I'm going to stick with what I was going to go with originally.
Love it. Okay.
So this one is kind of pulls up from one that I learned from Ken Page, he has this podcast called Deeper Dating. He's a social worker in New York City, I'm pretty sure, has a really great book podcast about dating.
Love me some Ken Page.
And he's a gay guy himself, and most of the stuff in the dating space I think is garbage. But his is one that I appreciate quite a bit. But he has this exercise called the inner mentor process. And so this is kind of adapted from that. It's probably not going to match his exactly, but it would probably help if you had like a pencil and a piece of paper for once we get to the end of it. But if not, grab one and listen to this later. But so starting just with, first of all, just grounding and noticing where you are and just landing where you're sitting right now, taking in your space for a little bit, maybe feeling your body's being supported in whatever ways your body is being supported, either by the chair that you're sitting on, the floor beneath you. It sounds maybe a little bit silly, but maybe even just noticing that your skeleton is doing a really good job of supporting you. And then thinking to a time when you felt like the fullest version of yourself, where you felt really connected to yourself, where you felt free, comfortable in your own skin. This might be an experience in nature, by the beach, or in the mountains. This might be how you feel when you're with your pet. Maybe this is a feeling that you felt when you were, I don't know, at the Taylor Swift concert. But just this very alive version of yourself and noticing what you're feeling in your body. What does your breath feel like? Is there some expansion, some energy? Is there a sense of more presence? And then just hold that memory. And we're going to move to an experience where you felt deeply loved by someone. And for this someone, it would probably work better if this is someone that you don't have complicated backstory with. A parent is probably not the easiest one. An ex is probably not the easiest choice. Maybe a grandparent or some other person in your life. Maybe it's a spiritual figure. Or maybe it's even a character from a novel you've read that feels like a person who embodies perfect love. And then taking into your body the experience of being loved and loved well. A love without conditions, without qualifications, without caveats, without disclaimers. And holding that memory, and we're sort of going to fast forward into the future and imagine yourself having worked through the bulk of, or a chunk of, what feels like it's in the way. Those feelings of fear, unworthiness, the sense of limitation. And this you is a version of you who's able to love, who's creative, who feels good in your own skin. The you that you're meant to be. The you who is fully alive. And sort of like you're looking at a movie, look at how this you takes up space. How do they move through the world? What does their face look like? What emotion do you see on their face? How do they interact with the people that they care about? This you that's completely unafraid to be you, to live as you are, to take this you that's not afraid to take up adult-sized space in your own life. This you who has a voice. And then imagine that you can just jump into the skin of this human being. This evolved version of you. This full version of you. And then imagine this version of you looking at the you today. That version of you cares about your growth. You're thriving. And from here, what does that version of you have to say to today's version of you? And this is where you grab your pen and paper and start to write some of that down. And just let it flow. Write whatever shows up. Don't worry about getting punctuation and spelling and grammar correct. Just see what happens. And this piece of the exercise can take as long as it needs to take. But I'm not going to wait for 15 minutes while you're writing to pause to get to the end. But that's the exercise.
I love that. Yeah, I think that's so beautiful. And I definitely want to sit with that.
I like the assumption that there is this.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Ken sort of describes this as working the maze from both ends. There's the spot where we are right now, and then there's the wise version of us that already knows how this maze works and has navigated it and knows how to help us.
Yeah,
is sort of calling to us kind of from the other end of the maze.
Yes. Yeah. And it fits so well with what you were saying too about just the inherent goodness that we have within us. It's that voice, that inner wisdom that has always been there, just tuning into it. So thank you. That's really
that deep, trustable wisdom that's just inherent to who we are.
Right.
That so many of us have been cut off from because of how we've just had to figure out how to exist in the world. So
yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. Well, Jeremy, this has been so wonderful to have you here today. I'm just curious to know how how can people find you? Are you working with clients? Like, are you on social media? Tell us where you're at.
I mean, technically I'm on social media, but don't follow me on any of those places because I never post.
Okay.
My website, my private practice here in Nashville is called Thrivery. Mm-hmm. And my website address is thriverynashville.com. Mm-hmm. You can contact me through my website, or if you're in Tennessee and want to work with me, or if you are not in Tennessee, I see clients through Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, and I'm taking clients in both places. So
awesome. And one final question. Mm-hmm. This is, I know your bookshelf is right behind you, but if you had a go-to resource or two, well, we're going to cap it at two for you, for folks in the LGBTQ community or for queer folks who are looking to resolve or recover from religious trauma, where would you point people?
Oh my gosh. Okay. One of them, actually, my favorite book is Tara Brach's Radical Acceptance.
Oh, yeah.
It's such a great book for working with shame, which is kind of one of our core gifts.
Yeah. It's a really pretty coat that you wear, of shame. Yeah. So the coat of colors.
I think that's for us, for those of us that grew up in spaces where this core aspect of our humanity was not seen, validated, tended to, cared for, nurtured. Shame is so present. Yeah. And Radical Acceptance is such a great book on just working with shame and being present with shame and giving it care. There's a maybe one that I just got yesterday from Amazon, because this is whatever. I heard about this on a different podcast. It's the Soul of Queer Folk. And so I'm going to just read something quick. Yeah. There's this one chapter about LGBTQ plus cultural values. And I'm just going to read what the cultural values are, because that's why I picked up this book. And I'm super curious to see what this book turns into. But the core values are equity, diversity, inclusion, community, creativity, pride, self-realization, sex positivity, gender fluidity, nonconformity, agency, perceptiveness, freedom, nurture, care, resilience, and zest.
Oh, I'm loving all of that.
I'm realizing that there's not a lot that I read about the queer experience that isn't struggle focused.
Yeah.
And so there's something here that's so much about
the resilience.
The resilience piece.
Yeah.
Like what we're healing towards.
I love that. So if you would say the title and the author again of that book.
I'm not even sure if it's a recommendation yet. I heard this guy on a podcast and I really liked him on the podcast. So that's why I'm The Souls of Queer Folk, How Understanding LGBTQ plus Culture Can Transform Your Leadership Practice, by Joel Davis Brown.
I love that. Well, those are excellent recommendations. Or partial recommendations. Yeah.
Also, that's terrible. Let me know.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure it's not going to be terrible.
Yeah, I love it. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Laura.
We are so glad that you have that you're doing this work and that you have been willing to share with us. So, like Jeremy said, you can find him on his website. You can find him on the CTRR website. And any final words? It's okay if there's not.
Not that I can think of.
It's kind of like all God's people said, amen or something. Okay. And thank you so much again to Jeremy for such a wonderful conversation. I know I mentioned at the beginning of the episode that Jeremy's a friend of mine, and you can probably see why. He just is such a delightful human being and has so much wisdom and so much insight. I know that I've, as a person, grown just and been challenged by him in such amazing ways. And I'm so glad that each of you got a chance to listen to him as well. I know, as I'm kind of reflecting on this episode, I'm just really trying to take in all the things that he said. We said it in the episode that there's many of these things that apply to anybody coming out of high control religion, cults, fundamentalism, things like that. But I think it's so important to have people that are speaking directly to marginalized groups of people, especially those who are so marginalized within these religious systems. Because as much as there is that similarity of, different things that we're processing, as it's so apparent from today's conversation, there are so many things that are just different or deeper or more nuanced for people in different marginalized identities and groups. And so to be able to have somebody like Jeremy who can speak to that from his own personal experience as well as his experience with clients feels really, really important. So I appreciated I think one of the things I appreciate the most about how Jeremy works with clients, and he mentioned this in the podcast, is that he really takes that relational approach. And I think I just love the fact that he talked so much about how important relationships are to healing and how that is an area that queer folks often don't have access to inside of, culturally, societally, but also just within religion, and how there is that internalized fear of yourself and other people, which really impedes the relationship piece of it. And yet relationships are what we need to heal. And so I love that he is so intentional in bringing that into his sessions with clients. What he said about like showing up as a human in the room, there's no questions that are off limits, feels really important. I've noticed that for myself in work, especially with my religious trauma clients, is that there's something really necessary about showing up as a human in a boundaried and structured way. But this is a relationship, right? It's a different type of relationship, between a therapist and their client or a coach and their client, but it's a relationship. And so I think there's so many clinicians and coaches that forget that and become the professional behind the board. And so I think just having that reminder from Jeremy is so important of like, I, as the therapist or as the coach or as the clinician, I'm a human first, and I can show up in that way. And I think that is what allows for so much healing to happen. I know when I think back to various therapists and coaches that I've worked with, it's been the people that I've worked with that have shown up as themselves and not been afraid to make mistakes or not say the right thing, or, sometimes be a little messy or quote unquote unprofessional. And that has given me permission to do the same. And so I think that, it just seems really, really important that Jeremy's able to bring that into his sessions. And I would imagine that his clients feel really safe inside of that. And so to that point, he did say he was taking clients if you're in Tennessee or, he can do therapy with you. Or if you're outside of Tennessee, there's the option of coaching. And I do want to mention one other resource that Jeremy mentioned after we hit the stop record button. And he wanted to make sure that he told people that he also really, really recommends Matthias Roberts' book, Beyond Shame. And I echo that. Matthias does excellent work. He is also a therapist and works with folks in the queer community, deconstructing the shame pieces of those religious experiences, especially around sexuality and identity. So Matthias' book, Beyond Shame, is also another really, really great resource. All of the information for Jeremy is going to be in our show notes as well as our website. So don't hesitate to get in contact with him. And I'm just so thankful that we were able to have him as a guest for today. So with that, another episode is complete. Thank you so much for being here with us today. We look forward to talking to you again.